The snow fell so thickly that the horizon vanished, leaving only a white void. 87 women shivered inside the cramped tents, whose roofs were already bending under the weight of ice and snow. Each of them had grown up hearing the same words: the enemy will show no mercy, and surrender means suffering. The wind cut through their bodies, and it felt as if the frost itself was their sentence. That night, fear and cold met something none of them could have expected. People said the war was ending, that the tanks and guns would soon fall silent, and soldiers would return home. But for these women in Belgium, winter 1945 was a world where words meant nothing to the bones. Snow fell without pause, each flake like a tiny bite, and the cold cut through them to the marrow. 87 women huddled inside the cramped tents, pressing against one another, trying to conserve heat. They were of all ages, girls barely 18, and older women whose faces were lined with wrinkles telling stories of life before the war. All of them had heard the same terrifying tales: being taken prisoner meant suffering, and no one would help. The blizzard struck the tents in waves. The wooden frames groaned under the snow's weight, and the fabric tore in places, letting in the bitter wind. The women pressed themselves to the ground, holding hands, clinging to the only sense of safety they could find. Their faces were pale, eyes wide with fear, and their breath came out in visible puffs in the freezing air. Every sound, from cracking wood to the dull thud of snow, seemed like a threat. Outside the tents, Canadian soldiers patrolled. They were young, faces tense, but every movement showed discipline and resolve. For the women, it was a moment of dread. Would they be left to die here in the snow, or would someone show mercy? Some whispered about possible salvation, others about inevitable death. The wind carried their thoughts back and forth, memories of families, hopes for the war's end, and the fear of the approaching night, coming faster than anyone could prepare for. Yet, despite the terror, there was something in the soldiers' eyes, in the way they stood firm on the frozen field, that sparked a fragile hope. It was not words, but actions that could change fate. And none of the women yet knew that this night, they would discover that mercy could exist even where it seemed impossible. The blizzard showed no mercy. Snow piled higher with every passing hour, collapsing some of the weaker tent walls and sending gusts of icy wind into the huddled group. The women's teeth chattered uncontrollably, and their fingers and toes turned numb. Whimpers and shivers filled the tents as they pressed even closer together, trying to share warmth, but the cold was relentless. Every breath seemed to crystallize in the air, turning into tiny shards of frost that stung their lungs. Panic whispered among them, maybe no one would come. Maybe the stories they had been told all their lives, of merciless enemies, were true. Outside, the Canadian soldiers were not idle. Despite the wind and snow whipping against their faces, they moved from tent to tent, checking the structures, reinforcing poles with ropes, and clearing pathways through the drifts. One soldier knelt beside a particularly weak tent, pulling stakes from the snow and driving them back into the frozen ground, his hands turning red from the cold. Another carried bundles of blankets, wet with snow on one side, but warm enough to provide at least a layer of protection. The women inside could see shadows moving through the storm, glimpses of strong, determined figures working tirelessly. It was a sight that conflicted with everything they had feared. These were not men coming to harm them. Some of the older women watched silently, disbelief etched into their faces. "Why?" one whispered to another. "Why would they do this for us?" The younger ones clung to the older women, hiding their faces against fur-lined collars and trembling with both cold and astonishment. One soldier reached inside a partially collapsed tent, gently lifting a small child into his arms and wrapping her in a thick blanket. Her tiny eyes widened as she peeked out at him, and he smiled, a simple human gesture in the heart of the storm. The wind roared around the camp, but a sense of protection began to spread inside the tents. For the first time in hours, fear gave way to fragile hope. the women realized that mercy could come quietly, through actions rather than words. They did not need promises, they needed survival, and these soldiers were giving it to them. Some began to murmur prayers, not for vengeance or deliverance from enemies, but simply in gratitude for the warmth, the blankets, and the steadfast presence outside their flimsy shelters. As the night deepened, the soldiers continued their rounds, patrolling the perimeter and ensuring no one was left exposed to the storm. The blizzard would not stop for them, and it would not show mercy, but the Canadians' determination created a shield of humanity in the middle of a frozen hell. In that moment, the women understood that even in the darkest chapters of war, acts of courage and kindness could survive, and that these acts might be the very things that keep life alive. The night stretched on, unyielding and merciless. Snow swirled through the camp in blinding sheets, piling higher against the tents and turning the world outside into a white void. Inside, the women huddled together, shivering and exhausted, their bodies trembling from the cold. The sound of wind whipping across the fields was relentless, a constant roar that drowned out even their whispered prayers. Each gust rattled the fragile tent walls, making them sway and groan as if threatening to collapse entirely. Fear gripped them anew, but amid the terror, there were also glimpses of something they had never expected: compassion. Through the storm, the soldiers moved with deliberate determination. One by one, they checked each tent, their boots crunching through snowdrifts, their breaths steaming in the icy air. Blankets, extra coats, even rough wooden boards were distributed where the tents were weakest, creating a patchwork of improvised shelter. Soldiers crouched beside trembling women, offering gentle words, gestures of reassurance, and sometimes simply a hand to hold. It was an intimacy that many of the women had never known, a stark contrast to the fear and hatred they had been taught to expect from the enemy. Some of the younger girls could barely contain their astonishment, their wide eyes following every movement as if trying to memorize the proof that mercy existed. One older woman, her face etched with years of hardship, sat shivering in the corner of a tent. She had seen war from its earliest days, seen families torn apart and villages burned, and yet now, here, she watched men who had once been strangers risk their own comfort to keep them alive. "I don't understand," she whispered to no one in particular. "Why do they care?" Her voice trembled with both cold and disbelief. A soldier, noticing her, crouched down and offered her a blanket. "Because it's the right thing," he said simply. "Because people still matter." That simple sentence carried more weight than any promise. It was a testament to human decency in the middle of a frozen, hostile world. The storm continued to rage outside, but within the tents, a fragile calm settled over the women. They shared blankets, pressed closer to one another, and allowed themselves to breathe a little easier. Some began to whisper, sharing names, stories, and fragments of memories, as if trying to reclaim their humanity amidst the chaos. One soldier brought a small lantern into a tent, its warm light flickering over anxious faces. For a brief moment, the harsh white of the storm was replaced by golden warmth. Mothers clutched daughters, girls leaned against strangers for comfort, and even the oldest women allowed themselves a tentative sense of hope. Hours passed, and the blizzard showed no sign of ending. Yet, the Canadians remained vigilant. They built small windbreaks outside tents, patrolled the perimeters, and offered water and morsels of food to the women, often risking deep snowdrifts and frostbite. Each act of care, each small gesture of protection, wove a lifeline for those trapped in the storm. By midnight, fear had not vanished entirely, but the women began to see the truth: survival was possible, even in the harshest conditions, because of the soldiers' unwavering commitment. That night, they learned a lesson they would never forget: that courage and mercy could exist even in a world dominated by fear, and that humanity could shine through the darkest nights. Dawn arrived slowly, pale and diffused through the storm clouds. The blizzard had weakened but had not entirely ceased, leaving the camp blanketed in pristine white. Tent flaps, torn and battered, sagged under the weight of snow, but most had survived the night, thanks to the tireless efforts of the Canadian soldiers. For the women, the first light revealed the aftermath of a night they would never forget. Their faces were pale from cold, eyes still wide with the lingering shock of fear, but there was also a fragile glimmer of relief. They had survived, and it was not by chance. The soldiers were already moving through the camp, checking on everyone, distributing food and warm water. Simple acts, handing out slices of bread, offering a sip of tea, smoothing blankets around shivering shoulders, felt monumental after hours spent in terror. The women watched quietly, some too exhausted to speak, some still too wary to fully trust. Yet with each gesture, each careful movement, the realization sank in: they had been cared for, protected, and preserved from the night's merciless cold. No one had left them behind, no one had abandoned them. The stories they had grown up believing, that the enemy would show no mercy, that surrender meant death, had been proven wrong in the most unexpected way. A young girl, barely 18, stood at the edge of a tent, her fingers clutching the thick blanket draped around her shoulders. She looked across the snow-covered camp at the soldiers trudging through drifts, their boots leaving deep impressions in the frozen ground. For the first time in her life, she saw the enemy not as a faceless figure of fear, but as a human being willing to risk discomfort, frostbite, and exhaustion to protect those who had been taught to hate them. The thought was dizzying. She pressed her face to the blanket, letting tears freeze on her cheeks, not from cold but from relief and astonishment. The older women moved more slowly, but their expressions were no less profound. One whispered to her neighbor, "They did not let us die." The words were simple, yet heavy with the weight of understanding and gratitude. Another woman, her hands still numb from the night's cold, clutched the blanket tightly to her chest, as if holding on to proof that compassion could survive even in war. The camp had been a place of fear, but now it was a place of quiet endurance, a testament to the choices people could make when faced with moral tests in the harshest conditions. As the morning progressed, the women began to emerge from their tents, tentatively at first, then with more confidence. They helped one another clear paths through the snow, offering hands to those who struggled. The soldiers watched, some smiling faintly, some quietly acknowledging that their work had succeeded beyond expectation. The storm had tested everyone, but the night had revealed the unexpected truth of humanity, that acts of courage and mercy could exist even amidst chaos and hatred. By mid-morning, the camp settled into an uneasy calm. Snow still fell lightly, and the cold remained sharp, but the immediate danger had passed. The women looked to the soldiers with a mixture of awe, gratitude, and lingering disbelief. They had come into the night believing themselves abandoned, left to freeze, yet they had been given life, protection, and hope. The lessons of that night would remain with them forever, that fear can be conquered by action, that mercy can appear when it is least expected, and that even in war, humanity can prevail. As the sun broke weakly through the clouds, glinting off the snow, the women and soldiers alike paused for a moment, acknowledging silently what had passed. In that frozen field of Belgium, history had been written not only by guns and battles, but by the quiet courage of those who chose to act with compassion. The blizzard had raged, the night had tested them all, yet when the storm ended, it left behind something enduring, a memory of mercy, a proof that even in humanity's darkest hour, kindness could prevail. If this story mattered to you, consider subscribing. More forgotten history is coming.